metals that are problems. Lead toxicity is a particular problem in areas where people hunt for waterfowl. And now basically lead shot's made illegal throughout, I think, all the US. And for that reason, the waterfowl, they're in soft sediments, but they need hard rocks or something solid for their crop because they don't have teeth, so that's how they grind up their food. They pluck out pebbles and such from their environment. When there's a lot of lead shot around, they just pluck that out, and then they basically get higher and higher levels, which then ends up being bad for the people that eat them as well. So that's an environmental regulation that was fought by the hunting community because they didn't feel that the spread that you got from lead shot was, from steel shot was as good as what you got from lead shot. But that seems to be sort of gone now. Not an issue anymore. Mercury contamination of fish, this is a huge one now, that essentially every state in the nation has fish advisories related to mercury consumption. You can't, and what you want to do is you will want to avoid eating big old fish because they bioaccumulated. So if you're going to eat fish from the environment, you can go after your trophy for the trophy's sake, but for regular eating, you're probably better off eating small, fast-growing fish than you are big old fish. We talked about this already because of atmospheric deposition, both from burning coal that sort of bioaccumulated it for thousands and thousands of years, got compressed, or from burning trash that has mercury component in it, electronics, thermostats, thermometers, batteries sometimes have mercury in them. All those things, when they get into incinerated trash, will go up into the atmosphere. One of the things that's interesting that happens is that the mercury has to be methylated to be really toxic. So when, like my grandma had surgery when I was a kid, and she had constipation issues, and they just gave her a ball of mercury to eat, right? Forced everything through. And it didn't kill her, but it's because actual elemental mercury is not as toxic as methylated mercury. If she would have had that much methylated mercury, she'd just been dead like that. So the methylation occurs by bacteria in the environment, and it turns out that it can be stimulated by various environmental factors. So that's a big area of study as to what environmental conditions lead to greater methylation rates of mercury, because then it enters the food chain much more rapidly and has much more toxic effects. In areas that have naturally high selenium, it can concentrate as water evaporates, and this is particularly a problem in areas that are using this water for agriculture. In the Central Valley in California has these problems because it's a fairly dry climate. The crops are irrigated, and the water has enough selenium in it that if they just add the irrigation water and let it all evaporate, then the selenium builds up in the soil, or it washes out and builds up in the water. It can be toxic to waterfowl, and people also shouldn't be drinking it. So that's been a problem in much of many areas that irrigate regularly, and particularly areas near desert areas, and where you get the water out of the mountains and you bring it in and irrigate real dry areas. Arsenic in groundwater is a huge issue. Probably the biggest is in India and Bangladesh, where there's natural deposits of arsenic that have built up over time. And then people pull the water up for drinking water, and they poison themselves. And it's thought to be made worse by using fertilizers, agricultural fertilizers, and having phosphorus work its way down to the groundwater and free up the arsenic. Next topic is organic contaminants. And there are more than 10,000 created that are used regularly by people for their own purposes. Several hundred new each year. And unlike drugs, you essentially can put things out into the environment until they're proved to be toxic. Now, if you know they're toxic and you're putting them out, then you're going to get sued and lose money. But there's not as rigorous of a required period of testing before people put In addition, you can imagine with this many compounds out there, the interactions between them will be very difficult to pin down. So there's a whole bunch of them. Petroleum products are really important because we use so much fossil fuels, and that there's a lot of runoff from urban areas, and urban areas are under requirements to actually treat storm runoff and put it into holding basins so that the microbes can eat up that organic pollutant before it goes out into the rivers and streams and lakes. The one thing is, a lot of places actually have limits on, they don't allow two-stroke engines, and that's because they basically shove their exhaust through the water, and they contaminate the water, and they use the water to cool the engine through that. And if you've ever run a two-stroke motor, you can see that, you start it up and the gas just kind of spreads out over the surface. 11,000 cubic meter of water in an hour is a lot of water to contaminate as far as the quality of drinking water. And you can imagine this influences the organisms in the water as well. There's a long legacy of problems with chlorinated hydrocarbons, polychlorinated biphenyls. PCBs were used as a heat transfer agent in electrical transformers and a lot of other industrial applications. Entered the food chain and because of the chlorines, they're fairly refractory to being broken down by microorganisms, and so they stay in the environment for a long time. There are major multi-million-dollar cleanup projects related to this in all parts of the country, particularly the Northeast, where the industrial activity has been, Northeast U.S., where industrial activity has been more intense. And they'll do things like literally have to go into a river and suction up all the sediment off the bottom and take it somewhere away from the food webs so they can bury it and keep it safe. Perhaps treating it with bacteria that can break that stuff down a little bit faster. One of the most common chemicals that's used agriculturally, so there's also a whole lot of application of pesticides. And the pesticides are either used to get rid of plants or animal pests that not wanted in agriculture. One of the first examples we talked about already was Rachel Carson and DDT to knock insects out. It was used for mosquito control, but also essentially all insect control. And it bioconcentrated, and so they came up with a whole series of different types of toxic chemicals that would, one, you want it to target the pest as closely as possible so it doesn't have negative health effects on the other animals in the ecosystem and plants and on people. Two, tends not to be lipid soluble, right? Tends to be more water soluble because then it's much less likely to bioconcentrate, as we know. And three, breaks down fairly readily. So those are some of the things that some of the phosphate-containing pesticides that are out there now, and some of the other ones, they don't tend to last as long. Atrazine is probably the most common chemical used, and it's basically a weed killer that interferes with photosynthesis. So it's actually a very broad spectrum compound against plants. It is water soluble, so it goes out from the fields easily into the aquatic environment. It doesn't tend to bioconcentrate that much because it is water soluble. The biggest problem associated with it is that it actually has negative effects on development of amphibians, and that's because they have these exposed eggs that get high concentrations of it against them, and that it has also some estrogen type activities, some developmental. And this brings up a new class of compounds that are causing problems, mean, they've always been causing problems, but it's newly recognized, and these are endocrine disrupting compounds. And the issue is that endocrines act at very low concentrations because they're signaling molecules that animals use to do things like develop, to grow organs, to regenerate, basically how they run their body. But they don't want to make a lot of them, right? Because it's energetically costly. You want a very small signal that is there for a short period of time and then goes away, so you can regulate the way your body works. And DDT is one of these, and groups of compounds that in particular tend to be estrogen mimics. And estrogen is very central to the way organisms develop, and so probably that's the most one of the likely routes for developmental problems of aquatic organisms that are exposed to these compounds. So atrazine was being worked on by Tyrone Banks, who is a toxicologist at Berkeley, and he did these experiments to try to figure out what the threshold concentration was of effect. And the idea, which we already discussed, was that you want to basically do these tox experiments and figure out, okay, there's some concentration below which it shouldn't matter, and we can just use them. So if we can get them in high enough concentrations where they need to be, but get them diluted out before they get out into the rest of the environment, that's one way to mitigate the negative effect of herbicides and pesticides. So he did a dilution sequence, and it was using African clawed frogs in development, and for some reason decided to do it in minute quantities that he didn't think would have any effect at all. And as expected, he saw this decrease in effects of toxic effects down to a concentration, and they all went away. But then all of a sudden, at these very low concentrations, he was seeing developmental problems in these amphibians. And so this is the idea of this low concentrations being required. Not only low concentrations being required, but they're not even active at high concentrations. It's these signaling molecules need to work in a fairly narrow range of concentrations. So he published this stuff and got really attacked by the chemical industry about it, but he continued to move forward, and that was one of the early ideas that there are these problems. Now, when they've gone out and done surveys of wildlife, they found a lot of cases of feminized wildlife because of this low level exposure to estrogen mimicking compounds. And this includes very large surveys of all the key freshwater fish species throughout the U.S., where they found that this is widespread in most all states where they looked for it. Alligators are having problems reproducing because of this, and a variety of other organisms. It's also been hypothesized that this could explain why male sperm counts have decreased in developed countries over time, but human male. But that's not a strongly established link. It's just a hypothesis. Some people have been looking for it, so it's questionable whether that's true or not. Because we get exposed to this stuff in our drinking water at low levels as well. Some of these can be bioconcentrated and passed to offspring, so not only can the developmental problems occur in the offspring, but they can pass developmental problems to their offspring through this process. And you can imagine how this could happen also, because like female humans, they create essentially all their eggs as they develop, right? When they're born, they're all already created, and so it's any early problems in that can be transmitted to essentially grand offspring, if you want to think of it that way. And it turns out that we can get these strange synergistic effects with these estrogen acceptors. So it's an area that probably has received interest for the last 5 to 10 years, and we're just starting to understand what these influences might be. When people go out into the environment and start looking for chemical compounds, they can find a surprising array of biologically active compounds that are in the rivers and streams that come through sewage treatment plants. And these include birth control pills, the different chemicals that are also estrogen mimics, and other hormone mimics in those, caffeine, drugs that we use, antibiotics, all of those kinds of things. Yeah.
For the guy that did this study at Berkeley, did he find that what chemical was he studying?
Atrazine.
Did he find it's harmful at all levels or just at high and low? Is there a happy medium or?
Yeah, the problem is that if you use it, it's hard not to have it be at low concentrations everywhere. But yeah, he found it at high and low, but not. He found less effect at this intermediate concentration, then it popped back up to very low concentration.
And so atrazine is still being used?
Yeah, it's still the most common compound, I think, that's used on crops. And because there's a lot of benefits to reducing weeds and having more productive crops, it's remained in use. It's not regulated, not regulated in most places. I think some states might be regulating it now. There's actually been research here at Kansas State, and they figured out that if you do 2 short applications in the spring instead of one big one, and make sure you hit around when the first spring rains start, right before the rains start and right after, you can actually use a lot less concentrations and not have, maybe you put a bunch on the field and then wait for the rains to come, a bunch of it washes off. And so there are ways to mitigate this effect. And we see the wave of atrazine, the people that do the analysis see every spring see a wave of atrazine come through Tuttle Creek Reservoir and down out the system. So you can imagine the macrophytes and the phytoplankton are being knocked back a little bit by this thing that reacts to their photosystems. I don't have this here, but I would like to just shortly talk about another type of aquatic pollution that's become pretty widespread, and that is antibiotics. That there's been a lot of antibiotic use, and in the United States they allow feeding livestock low concentrations of antibiotics, even though they're healthy. It makes them grow faster. And this is leading to a situation where there's a lot of antibiotic resistance developing in bacteria that are associated with the feedlots. The thing with the antibiotic resistance, and actually resistance to heavy metals and any other compounds, is that the genes for this tend to occur on plasmids. And these little circular pieces of DNA that are in the bacteria can be transmitted from one bacteria to another, and eventually get transmitted into diseases that are infectious to humans, and they start showing up in hospital infections, making it difficult for us to continue treating bacteria. In addition, if we take antibiotics and don't take the full course, or if you always give people antibiotics whenever they have a cold, even though it's a viral infection, the continuous exposure to antibiotics, you increase the probability that bacteria will evolve the ability to resist those antibiotics. So now you can go out into lakes in the middle of Australia that have had no real human runoff in them and pull bacteria out and find antibiotic resistant genes in them, or out in the middle of the ocean for that matter. That's another sort of global change in the way we've tried to control disease, and not, because of an organic contaminant, we've not been able to do so as effectively as we would like. In addition to this, there's some concern about how the atmosphere partitions out environment. So there's a partitions out pesticides. So there was a survey that the Canadian government did of high latitude lakes, high in the Arctic, right? Which, I mean, people maybe come in on a plane there every once in a long while, and maybe the Inuits came through there, but there's no agricultural chemical use in there for thousands of miles. And then just as part of the routine, they collected all these fish and ran them through lab that just analyzed everything, and they were getting these high concentrations of the toxicity, which is another agricultural chemical that's used, and it totally surprised them. And it turns out what happens is that the atmosphere acts like a condensing column. So like, I don't know if you guys remember your organic chemistry, but when you did a distillation, right, you start boiling the stuff, and then the lower temperature stuff comes off first, and then the higher temperature, right? But the volatile stuff comes off first, and it goes up high in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere actually acts like a condensing column and allows this to be transported long distance away, some particular compounds. So then they found out these compounds were being put into the mountains or up into the Arctic. Added to that was that because it's an extreme environment, that it's cold for much of the year, that it's ice covered, the fish have to live a long time before they can be reproductive, and they grow very slowly. Well, that gives them a lot of time to bioconcentrate, plus the food webs are fairly long there, actually. And so there's a lot of bioconcentration of this stuff. So you get into these places where you think it would be pristine, and they have some pretty bad negative effects. And it would be fish you wouldn't want to eat, even though you're out in the middle of an Arctic lake. So there's some other things that have been surprised and sort of demonstrate our, if not regional, if not global, if not regional effects of what we do as humans to the environment. So what do you do to deal with this stuff? Well, one of the nice things is that, you know, evolution works against you when it comes to creating microbes that are antibiotic resistant, but it also works for you because it's very similar to this idea that we came up with in the nutrient cycling, where if a compound has potential energy in the environment, some organism will evolve an ability to use that. Likewise, evolution has led to creation of all kinds of organisms creating all kinds of novel organic compounds. And so that would include like the tannins and lignins that land plants evolved for structural material and to reduce decay rates of that structural material. And organisms then evolve ways to deal with those. That if you can find a way to break down a novel compound that's in relatively good concentrations in the environment as a microbe, if you can solve that problem evolutionarily, then you have a competitive advantage because you have a food source that nobody else can use. So when we look at these areas where there's been contamination by organic compounds, at low levels at least, there's usually some organisms that have an ability to break those compounds down. So we talked about this rapid ability of bacteria to evolve and withstand use organic compounds, including antibiotics, at least resistant, but they can also break them down. And they use these plasmids to move this information among bacteria and across actually species of bacteria. So what will happen is there's sort of two ways to do it. One is like if you have a polluted water or polluted sediment, you can take it out and expose the bacteria to it that you've cultured, that you've cultured to break down this toxin, this PCBs or something like that, and then you put it all back. Or the other thing is to leave it in place and put the microbes in that habitat to speed up the breakdown of that material. What happens when you have the bacteria that you've cultured, the bacteria usually, when you put them into the natural environment, disappear. But their plasmids don't. They spread out into other microbes that are there. And you do accelerate the rate that those things are broken down in. Yeah?
When you say rapidly evolve, like how quick for bacteria?
Well, just depends on how many there are and how fast they're growing. But usually if you can run a few hundred generations and thousands, millions of cells in a flask like that, and you could do that in the order of weeks. It really depends on how difficult of it, what you're talking about exactly. So if you're talking about, say, change in temperature optimum, you might be able to get it in almost days. But some of the tough compounds it might take months for the right chain of metabolic things to evolve. Because maybe you have something that first makes it less toxic, and then it's making it less toxic because it's cleaving off part of the molecule, and then all of a sudden that molecule becomes available to be broken down for respiration or something. So you can see that there might be a whole series of steps that have to come about to allow metabolically to use that. That's a good question. And so we see in places where gasoline has gone down and sitting on top of the water table, oil spills in the marine environment, a lot of times they'll fertilize, throw bacteria on it, try to get the bacteria to break that stuff down faster. A lot of different places where this occurs. It's also occurring next to oil deposits underground as well. And next to coal, there's just slow levels of activities that are continuously breaking down these organic materials. So it's a natural part of the process, and you know, humans are clever and have figured out ways to take advantage of that. One of the most common types of pollution, that's certainly very common in this part of the world, is increases in suspended sediments. And these sediments can smother invertebrates, but there's this give and take, because there are invertebrates that filter organic materials particles out of the water column and make a living on that. That includes some mussels and clams and black flies and net spinning caddisflies and a whole bunch of organisms there. But if you throw a bunch of inorganic sediments in there, then their food becomes rare essentially, and it makes it difficult for them as well. It clogs their filters. Largest mass of any pollutant. And it also interferes with fish reproduction. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of fish will need their eggs to be oxygenated. So they'll put them in gravel where the water kind of runs through them and continuously runs through them, but they're protected from predation. If the fine sediments come in and fill that all in, then the oxygen can't move in fast enough, and the eggs will die. This is in particular a problem with the salmonids and in the Pacific Northwest, when they have logging issues and they log right down to the edge of the stream, as they used to, and a tremendous amount of sediments come in when there's heavy rains. It makes it so the salmon can't reproduce at all. It just completely chokes off their habitat. In addition to this, it can increase light extinction rates and lower phytoplankton production. So actually, when we go to Tuttle Creek Reservoir many times here, it has a chlorophyll concentration that you would expect in an oligotrophic lake. It's actually barely detectable. And it's because the sediments use up the light, and the lake is mixing so deeply that the phytoplankton just gets so little light they can't make it there. So they have a nice green ring around the edge, because that's up high enough to get the light, but suspended in the water you don't have much. Many rivers and streams in the world are impounded, and this does a weird thing to the composition of the sediment, because what it does is it holds back the coarse sediment. The organisms that are in the lake then can respire away that stuff, and it puts out fine sediments and not much organic material after that. So we have the rivers downstream shifting to finer sediments and not as nutritious. This is one of the reasons that I think Josh talked about Frank Cross here, right, in this class, who is at the University of Kansas and is one of Josh's heroes. One of the really great ichthyologists in the Midwest. I don't know, he was known worldwide. But one of the questions was, why is it that the fishes in the Kansas River are taking it so hard? And he thought part of the reason for that was that these reservoirs were only allowing fine sediments, but not enough, essentially, foods through the food webs to allow them to keep their populations going. So how do you deal with suspended solids? You see those construction fences. You know, when I was a kid, they never put those fences up when they did construction. They just let all the sediment run off. You terrace cropland. You keep intact riparian vegetation around the streams. You don't crop right up to the edge. You don't log right up to the edge of all the rivers and streams. That is not a law in this particular state. That is, you can go out to, say, the Kansas River, looking for banks, and there's cornfields literally just falling into it. However, there are programs to encourage landowners to do that. And then also the other thing is, in dry areas that have a lot of cattle, they tend to increase sediment pollution quite a bit as well. And the opposite happens oftentimes in urban areas, because urban areas have, if they have high amounts of impervious surface, right, they cause quick runoff, but it doesn't run across soil, it's running across asphalt and concrete, and so it shoots in there, but it actually has lower sediment than would normally be coming off, and the sediment that's there is filled with toxins and fairly poor nutritional quality for the organisms that are in there. So it's an interesting thing, because a type of pollution, it's sort of like nutrient pollution, right? Nutrients are required, but if you add too much, then you move the system away from the desired condition and the native condition. Sediments are required with organic material for many organisms that live in rivers and streams and lakes, yet if you put the concentrations up too high and or shift them to inorganic sediments over organic sediments where they're not commonly seen, then you change the community in a way that perhaps you didn't want to. That said, there are some systems that are naturally high in suspended materials, suspended inorganic materials. Even some of the Kansas rivers, when the first explorers came through, they noted some of the rivers were extraordinarily turbid and some of them weren't. So, I mean, the Red River down in Oklahoma is red because it has high amounts of clay in it. So sometimes you do just naturally have high sediment loads. This is, in a sense, was a hot topic in the 60s because people would, when you have power generation, you have to cool off that steam so you can go back through the system, right? And so there's this excess heat waste that you use when you use steam to generate electricity, and this would be in coal plants or nuclear plants. And so there are these areas where people were increasing temperatures of water. In addition, when you put in a reservoir, oftentimes you'll increase the temperature of the water. If you take the water out of the hypolimnion, if you take it out of the hypolimnion, you actually artificially decrease the temperature. This can have adverse environmental impacts, including extending the range of exotic invaders. So you can have a species you don't want in an area, and if it has a thermal refuge in the winter time that it can go to, then it can spread out again. It can cause problems. Interfering with reproductive cycles and timing, making it so organisms that are using temperatures as cues for reproduction don't match their actual environment. Death of heat-intolerant species. We know we have salmonids versus bass and charcots, and a lot of them are warm water species. The salmonids are cold water species. You can shift the whole community. And the last thing is that the Earth is warming, and so this old research on thermal pollution that was sort of restricted now has become applied to what's going to happen to species shifts associated with global warming. And questions like in conservation, do you move a species into a place that matches its former thermal regime?